Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section, where we cover current topics in antitrust, consumer protection, and privacy. My name is John Roberti. I'll be your host today. And today's topic is, what do the numbers say? Using data as a compliance tool. The Department of Justice has recently issued guidance saying that they will provide credit for a robust compliance policy instituted by the company, and they'll apply that credit at the charging stage rather than at the sentencing stage. That new policy, and other things as well, I mean, to say nothing of trying to be a good corporate citizen, has really incentivized companies to try to understand better how to run a compliance policy and how to make that compliance policy most effective. Today, what we'd like to talk about with a couple of experts is, how do you use actual data to try to get out ahead on this compliance and try to make the compliance policy as effective as possible? My co-host is Wendy Waszmer.
Hi, Wendy. Hi, how are you? Glad to be back.
Well, thank you. So, Wendy, today we've lined up two experts from Ernst & Young, a very well-known firm that does many things, including forensics, to talk a little bit about using data in compliance programs. Why is it, do you think, that there is this renewed interest in compliance?
So I think it's interesting because with DOJ, SEC, and other agencies bringing really big cases, I think the environment has changed, whereas previously, you know, there may have been an employee issue that comes up and a company could perceive there to be an issue, but now it's so vast. Multinational companies are so vast. They have a hard time having coverage over all their businesses or all their people. And I think, you know, these data topics that we're going to talk about today, there's a challenge in trying to figure out, where do I start, where to find risk areas? Like how do I make sure that we're covered, because I want to be in a position to tell DOJ or tell the enforcer that we're trying to uncover violations and we're trying to get out ahead of problems.
Well, you know, and I think part of the challenge is always resources, because you could probably have a compliance program that would spend infinite money and find every single problem. But the fact is, you can't do that. And I think a big part of an effective compliance program is, how do you make the right choices about where to put your resources? Now, you're not always going to get that right, which is why I think the department is going to say, if you had an effective compliance program, explain to us why you missed this one. But if you have a system in place, it will help. And I think what we're want to learn more about is whether analyzing data can help you to make the program more effective.
Exactly.
Well, let's bring in our guests. Today we have Chris Wall and Liban from Ernst & Young. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
So, Chris, let's start with you. You're a competition lawyer by training. You've gotten into the data analytics space. Why is it that companies should use data analytics in their compliance program?
Well, traditionally, when it comes to compliance, we do a lot of training and more training. And then too often, I think we end up taking remedial action after that training turns out to be less effective. A lot of times when it comes to the data that's associated with our clients and with these large corporations or even smaller corporations, we just kind of ignore it. We know the data is there. Well, actually, sometimes we don't even know the data is there. But there's increasing amounts of this data that we can put to use. Okay, so a lot of times for other types of investigations, like corruption investigations, FCPA investigations, for instance, there's a money trail. There's a paper trail, so that you can track that back and see where the event actually occurred. You don't have that kind of trail when it comes to cartel activity. But what you do have is you have market activity. You have pricing activity, and that is measurable. And that's where the big data comes in. And again, we're going to be talking about big data. Big data is that data that's typically stored in a structured format. And when we talk about structured format, we're talking about data that's stored in rows and columns, essentially.
So you're talking about sales data, accounting data, and things like that.
Exactly. That kind of data that's out there and oftentimes goes unexamined.
Until it gets requested in a subpoena.
Yes.
It's basically, as you were talking, I keep thinking, I feel like we were requesting that stuff. And I always wondered whether the company itself had looked at it.
Yes,
right?
but
They're looking at it for the first time when they're putting it in an Excel to dump on, when I was at DOJ. But then it seemed sometimes that they were surprised by what it said.
Or if they were surprised, that's good. That means they were actually looking at it. I think a lot of times you ask for that data, or you know that the data is there and you actually produce the data. But then we don't necessarily give it the weight or the gravity that it deserves.
So Liban, you can go and a lot of times when we run into data and we analyze data, we know how to do it when we're in litigation, and we kind of know what we're looking for. So we can take the data and we can run regressions, knowing kind of where the conduct took place, trying to isolate that conduct and run comparisons. If you don't know what you're looking for, how do you find it?
Absolutely, and that's the biggest challenge. So in the litigation context, as you said, it's a retrospective review. You have some facts, not all the facts, and then you're looking in a very defined lens of patterns and behavior. And I think where now companies are shifting and taking a step back. Why are organizations starting to do this? You have a body of actions, whether it's in the antitrust space or in the FCPA space or sanction space, where you have all these intentions. And so when you look at each of the guidance, whether it's the DOJ guidance on antitrust or the OFAC guidance on sanctions, the language is very similar. There is a view on what they traditionally view as paper compliance programs, and that every organization has policies and procedures that are embedded and they train their employees on. And then those are what I would call sort of the good intention, right? It's there, we're training. And then there is this delta when there's misconduct. And so looking back, organizations are starting to think, okay, wait a second here. How can we be a bit more nimble and more effective? And there's a commercial benefit, not just sort of meeting one's regulatory requirements. Going to the point you made earlier, John, there is this cost pressure, resource constraint. And so the businesses are starting to think, well, can I use technology to meet a commercial need, which is cost reduction, and be able to address pain points in the monitoring area that result in human misconduct or human error? Are there ways that we can automate and essentially create a touchless process to collect information? And that's to meet our regulatory obligations when we do get that subpoena, and outside counsel is working with the company to figure out how to manage through that. To then starting thinking through, well, are there ways to become much more efficient from a commercial perspective? Are there ways that we can utilize our data in our compliance program to essentially monetize new areas for business? Can we be more self-service with respect to the business? And so every compliance officer that I talk to, whether they're dual-hatted in a legal role or just sitting under legal, they're having the same conversations, which is, I want to meet my regulatory requirements. I want to enable my stakeholders. Technology and being able to figure out what to prioritize is going to allow me to effectively do my job and, most importantly, retain talent. So, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this, but part of the challenge when you're in-house is getting really good people to stick with you in your compliance function. And the way we're seeing sort of a change in pattern where people are starting to say, you know what, by using technology, I'm focusing on higher level issues that allows me to focus my talents and not deal with the same 10 or 15 or 20 questions I get from the business every single day. Can you self-automate that? Can there be a chat box? And so I think there's a revolution going on because each of us as individuals have automation in our personal lives and are used to user interfaces that are much easier. And so then when we go into our employee in the business context, we have an expectation, the workforces, we have a generation of people who are now utilizing, whether they're used to using an iPad or iPhone or whatever mobile device, they're becoming more facile with technology. So I know I've taken us in a number of areas there, but I think that it really does drive to the change that we're seeing in our practice.
So maybe go back to Chris. Let me ask you this. Let's take a company that has a compliance program that has a couple of phases, and the first phase is to do a health risk assessment. Typically, those companies will do the risk assessment and maybe do a deep dive in half a dozen areas. How does data help them to choose
which of those areas?
Which are the 6 that they want to do?
Yeah. I mean, that becomes a real challenge for large multinational companies, especially, where the risk profile might be different in some geographies as opposed to others, for instance. That decision on where to do your deep dive, where to really focus your compliance efforts becomes really challenging. What we've found in working with our clients is by looking at this big data, the structured data that's out there, we can pull from an individual company data such as pricing history, of course, capacity history, utilization history. We can pull all of that data together and then marry it with data from the market as a whole. And many markets have this data available to them at the same macro level that you might find for the clients. Pricing history, capacity utilization. And then we look at, after we put those two things together, we can then look at traditional antitrust analysis components like barriers to entry. We look at differentiators, and we also look at how that affects the market as a whole. Traditional econometric analysis of what's going on within the company and in the market as a whole.
And are you using this kind of data in price fixing investigations? So I'll give you an example. Like, I'll go very old school. So, enforcers, of course, are used to paper records where they're comparing bids, or they're basically looking across time and looking at pricing. Are you using your technologies to be trying to figure out, let's say, a company that has 20 businesses, whether there's any like irregular pricing activity or whether there's parallel activity, such that you'd say to the compliance officer, hey, there's just something weird going on here for the past 4 years, and no one's seen it yet, but it looks like you've been tracking, and maybe this data is not public, or maybe it's going to be perceived as there's some sort of discussion going on.
Yes, that's exactly what we're doing, using technology, and I shouldn't leave out the human expertise that we apply to the whole process, because we do use economists to do part of this analysis to determine where there are some of those patterns that you might expect to see cartel activity.
So weirdness, right? You're looking for stuff that's weird, and the weirdness then becomes the places where you do the deep dive.
That's correct. Well, let's look at a company that has, let's say, 10 business units, okay? We could look at each of those 10 business units and look at whether there's weirdness or the degrees of weirdness within each of those business units. Then we could risk rank those for the corporation so they could determine where then to do their deeper dive.
And does that mean, like, once you are doing that risk analysis, are you seeing companies then bring in the team of outside counsel to come and do interviews, or is it marrying with what's more traditional internal investigative work, or are companies using data analysis almost as I wouldn't say replacement, but as a proxy for what previously was like internal auditing or interviewing?
Yeah, a lot of times it's prophylactic, right? A lot of times they're doing this on an ongoing basis so that they can nip cartel activity as in the earliest phases, so they don't have to go through the expense, the time, and the great risk of having to remedy it down the road. I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think it's just interesting because as you all probably perceive, there's probably a lack of comfort, so like with people who are not as tech savvy, to actually use big data sets to know the facts, because they're probably used to interviewing, let's say, John the perp, and like saying, did you call your competitor? What have you been doing? Like looking at his email, like that's a much more traditional way of like pulling John's email and reviewing front to back what he's been doing for 5 years, which is clearly super expensive and doesn't always get if he's been offline or been doing stuff like that. So
and it doesn't give you the objectivity that this data will necessarily. Okay, and that's the traditional way we do it. We do it through interviews. We do it through traditional market analysis, which doesn't always involve the data. We recognize the data's there, but I hate to say it, oftentimes we take that data, and I mentioned this before, we sweep it under the rug, and we don't use it for all it's worth.
Yep, and then the other piece beyond the structured data is the unstructured data. So most of our clients, I would dare say most Fortune 500 companies, 80% of the data that they have in-house is unstructured. And what I mean by unstructured data, we're talking emails, chats, documentation outside of the traditional spreadsheet database. And so we spend a lot of time marrying the two, integrating the structured and the unstructured to find patterns. And so, machine learning, RPA, robotic process augmentation, all of these new technologies allows us to actually identify, for example, in one area, emotive analytics. So if an individual is using a certain type of word or term or phrase, we're able to look back at the history of the custodian for many, many months, years, and be able to map out using an algorithm to say this is highly unusual communication. Does this marry up with any unusual patterns or activities that compliance is tracking or should be aware of? And that actually augments the interview structure. So the traditional blocking and tackling of saying, let's do our fact finding. Well, being able to come into the room and say, I've got this amalgam, no pun intended, of information that allows us to be able to have much more informed questions.
Well, and that's super interesting because you guys probably have experienced, I've seen investigations where there's code words, right? So John and I are colluding and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to go meet John for fish and chips or whatever it is.
I'm going to go do a podcast with John.
And that, like you said, the history of that conversation is a way to find. I mean, and sometimes it's less veiled like that. Like I don't want to go to jail or like I don't look good in orange or whatever. But I mean, I think what you're saying is a tool that wouldn't really. You can't replicate that with just human review or kind of hours and hours of typical lawyer work.
Exactly. And so I think where we're positioned as a firm as well is we're multidisciplinary. So as Chris mentioned, we have folks who have tremendous history from being economists and experiences, but it also is the internal audit function. So they're essentially the canary in the coal mine, understanding patterns and issues that are there, and then marrying that with a compliance piece in terms of the professionals there. So having an integrated approach to be able to say, these are the areas, going to your point earlier, how do you go about dealing with these ocean and universe of risks? How do you prioritize them? We have a pretty good foundation based on pattern and history to work from.
Liban, I introduced a term to our conversation, weirdness, which I think is probably not a term of art, but maybe a more a less silly term would be anomalies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so is a way to think about this? Phase one is you take the structured data and you look for anomalies, or you look for things. You look at a variety of factors. I think Chris was saying, that could include variances in the data, as well as predictive factors about, local culture or, market shares or things like that. And you sort of mix it up. And
look,
yeah,
it's not so different from what DOJ is doing today or other competition regulators around the world. They sense smoke, right?
Right.
They sense it. By using data, we're actually being able to triangulate where that smoke's coming from. Okay, that's the idea behind this large data analytics exercise. But you're right, John. After we've triangulated on where the smoke's coming from, then we do this deeper dive, and that's where we do what Liban was talking about, where we marry that with unstructured data, the traditional discovery-related data, like email, to figure out just what's going on.
And the smoke could be a forest fire, or it could be that I just left the bagel in the toaster oven too long, right? I mean, it could be nothing.
Absolutely.
But I guess that's the point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And how do you draw the line? Where do you say, okay, we can take, 6 is an arbitrary number of deep dives to take. Is there a line drawing exercise where you could maybe advise a client, you know what, you only really need to do 5 because there's a big drop off after 5, or if I were you, I would really do 8 because I have trouble distinguishing, 6 through 8.
Yeah, we have and that's where the human element and analysis and judgment comes into play in terms of deciding a demarcation. So we have a extensive methodology associated with risk ranking and bringing in legal, and a lot of times the conversation shifts to outside counsel to say, okay, here's where we are. And so a lot of the work we do is underprivileged as well. So in being able to make sure that the company is able to have a fulsome discussion on their risk exposure given the data. And so at the outset, a lot of the conversation really begins to say, okay, if we're going into this area, then we need to make sure that we are able to have a forum to be able to have as much of a conversation as possible to make the appropriate decision.
Well, so let me see if I have this right. So if I think about a compliance program that you might be helping a company with, phase one, so to speak, would be you all get the unstructured data, and you do some thinking and some investigating and market research, marry that up with the data, and apply in risk factors to spit out a list, rank ordered in terms of these are your greatest risks. Phase two then involves a discussion with the legal team or the compliance team that will say, okay, I'm looking at these risk factors. I think I can explain some of these. Let's push our resources into these 5 or 6 or 7. You then can help in the second phase with the unstructured data, using algorithms to pull out these emotive words that that again help you to focus even further the investigations. And I imagine you could slice and dice the structured data even more to help you with that as well.
During the course of that deep dive, that's exactly what we do. Is we slice and dice that data in any number of ways to make sure that we're locating that fire or the burning piece of toast. Yeah.
And the most critical aspect is scope in the beginning. And that's where we spend a lot of time beyond sort of just going off and saying, okay, we're going to look at this sort of, again, an ocean of information. Let's narrowly tailor it, scope it so that we get to the right place at the end of the day.
If you're going to give some advice to compliance officers about how to use data, what would you suggest? What tips would you have?
Know what data you've got. That's where I would start, because I think a lot of compliance officers don't know what they have. And of course, that's important from an information governance standpoint, right? But from a compliance standpoint overall, especially from a competition standpoint, it's really important.
And then second, going beyond knowing your data, having understanding and really partnering with IT. And when I say that, it's understanding the art of the possible, what's available within the enterprise structure, the operational, blocking and tackling of being able to use some technology within your framework. And so what normally happens is we have compliance officers come to us and say, that's really great. I want to use that. And they're not having the conversations within their own IT environment to make sure that they're meeting InfoSec or security agreements to make sure that they can actually utilize it. And so what ends up happening, and I'm sure folks can relate to it, is there's a very bespoke technology stack. And so when you're talking with compliance professionals and folks in-house, it's just trying to get a sense of that universe so that you can go to the point, which is Chris saying, you need to know your data. But understanding what the technology capabilities you have right now can save you a lot of time downstream in building it out.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I feel like you all are counseling to be more proactive to know what your data can do for you, whereas I feel like maybe more of the context of lawyers is reactive, which is I need to talk to the IT people to pull stuff out of the set now that we're in trouble. So, I mean, that's a different perspective, and maybe companies would understand if we do this now, there could be benefits, not just defensive kind of use of data or defensive kind of role with their IT team.
Well, one thing we do is a retrospective review on our investigation. So we know how much the spend is. And so a lot of times we'll go back and we'll say, in the last year, you spent X number of dollars on this process. That could have been automated. And would have saved you 75% of your spend. And here's how that would work. And so it's the economic argument we're trying to make. And then also, as you said, the reactive. So going to the point where we opened in this conversation, how to position yourself when you may unfortunately have an inquiry, to be able to go to the federal regulators and say, here's our methodology. Here's how we utilize technology. Here's how we risk ranked it. It was thoughtful, deliberative. We did everything in our power to try to address the issue. We missed it. But we feel that we did everything in our power to really move the needle to comply. And that, to me, that's the message most folks want to end up and where they want to end up.
Well, this is great. So I think, gentlemen, I think our listeners would like to maybe learn a little bit more about you individually. So maybe Liban, I can start with you. How did you end up where you did? What was your career trajectory? How did you come to be where you are?
So I started off as a lawyer, and I practiced at Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C. So I was a corporate and securities lawyer. my passion before even law school was investigative journalism. So most folks don't realize, people who don't know me, people that were very important in my life beyond my family and my wonderful parents were folks such as Carl Rowan, who was a journalist here in Washington, D.C., had a local political talk show with Gordon Peterson, who was a journalist with WUSA. And I got a scholarship that allowed me to go to college as part of that program. And Ed Bradley of 60 Minutes was a very important person in that process. And so for me, my dream was always to be a correspondent in 60 Minutes. I fell short and went to law school and wanted to do a lot of deep dives in investigative work. So I did a lot of white-collar investigations, securities-based. I went off to the federal government, did a number of investigations, and then I made a change after almost 20 years of practice to say, you know what? I've always been in the reactive world. I want to use technology. I want to be in the proactive world. Issues keep happening in these cases in terms of human emotional misconduct. So a big passion of mine is behavioral psychology. And I wanted to marry those into an advisory practice. So I ended up going and making the switch to consulting and being a partner at EY, doing the work that I do, which is really enhancing and building out compliance programs in a variety of different industries. So long-winded way of how I got to where I am today.
And Chris, you and I have ran into each other many years ago, back when you were an antitrust lawyer.
Yeah, many, many times over the years. And I am a recovering antitrust lawyer. About 15 years clean now. And after a few years of practicing at big firms, I left traditional legal practice and joined the consulting ranks. And I've loved it. I work with other lawyers still in my day-to-day job, and it's just in a different capacity. And I just love doing what we do here, where we get to not just make the world better, right, as we do at EY, but we make the world easier when we make our lawyer friends look like much smarter. So that's kind of our job. And
we need the help. So, all right. So Chris, staying with you, tell us something unusual about yourself that we wouldn't know if we just knew you professionally.
I don't know. I'm a pretty plain vanilla guy. But my hobbies, probably my favorite hobby is I make ice cream for my favorite hobby. And that's what I'll do on a free weekend.
What's your favorite flavor?
My favorite flavor is Szechuan orange.
Ice cream.
Is it
so it's salty?
It's spicy, so it's really orangey, right? And then as it goes down, it's got a little Szechuan kick. So
have you ever made ice cream for Liban?
No, I haven't. I have for other EY colleagues.
You haven't made it for me.
Okay, so
I'll remedy that.
It's a date.
Yes, absolutely.
How about Liban? How about you? Tell us something we may not know about you.
I don't think most folks know that I'm a big fly fisherman, and so I go off, and it's my time to recharge and reset. No cell phone. I go with a core group of friends from high school, and expanded it to a couple of folks in college, and we go out and we're on the water for hours, and much to the chagrin of many of my family members who view that as incredibly boring, I find it extremely peaceful. And for me, it's that being able to disconnect. And I don't think most folks know that I do that. I'm pretty sure that's not the case. So.
I'm going to get tips. I just got a rod.
Oh, fantastic.
After this, we need to I'm going to hit you up on it. I'm a novice.
I did not see Wendy Waszmer, fly fisherman, coming.
Well, you should see me trying to tie knots when I'm on conference calls. It's really embarrassing. But I will. Liban can tell me how to do it.
So, destinations? Where's the best place to go fly fishing?
Oh, I'm a big fan of. You can go up to Lake George, New York, pretty quickly. I'm also a big fan of heading up past Lake Washington in British Columbia and going up to Vancouver and the greater Seattle area as well. So, great spots all over the place there. Yeah.
Well, I think now we've come to our final segment, which we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat.
So in a true hat, we have index cards with various questions on them. And Liban and Chris each have pitched a question out of the hat. And Wendy and I will ask them to you. Wendy, do you want to go first? Chris?
What is your favorite cuisine?
I I'm going to go with Greek Mediterranean.
I thought you were going to say ice cream. Liban, what is your perfect weekend?
Perfect weekend. Ironically, since we're talking data, no technology. Just not connecting, reading a good book, being with family, good food, as we said. So my favorite cuisine is Indian. I could eat Indian food all day long. So a quiet weekend with the family and reading a good book. Perfect weekend.
So you need to make ice cream for him,
Yes.
and you need to introduce Indian food to him.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll see you next time on Our Curious Amalgam.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.org. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.